Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I'm joined today by Ryan. And we are going to dig into the origins of the American biscuit. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Our friends at White Lily Flour got a hold of us and they wanted to do a collaboration video. We were really excited about it because they have a great product, but we didn't know the best way to serve them and us. We settled on a biscuit, but that gets really difficult in the 18th century. So I started to talk to John and say, how can we tie this in?
So there is no biscuit like this. The epitome of, a dinner time biscuit that I love these things, but they are not 18th century, but there are the roots to this wonderful biscuit that go down into the 18th century, and it's a very, very particular American story. So I thought it would make a great episode where we can kind of make something like this and the 18th century version so we can compare the two, maybe even three, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of biscuits as they go through history. But what's really going on, what makes this biscuit kind of different is the leavening effect. Where does this light and fluffy biscuit come from? Because everything from the 18th century is usually either yeast, or it's a sour leaven, like you could think of sourdough bread, or possibly something that's leavened with eggs whipped up. So you've got lots of air in there. Those are the kinds of leavening, the airiness that you find in the 18th century, but not what we're used to, which is, in this case, pearl ash, or you might be more familiar with baking powder or baking soda. So we'll be working with three different kinds of biscuit recipes. We've got our very, very modern example here of a today's biscuit. I've got the very, very early recipe that gets us sort of on the road to biscuits. This is 1799. And what have you got?
Yeah, this is a late 19th century recipe that uses baking powder as a leavening agent.
So between these three, we'll kind of hit that timeline of sort of proto-American biscuit, right? And then biscuit as the 19th century, Civil War, and a little bit later, and then the classic, today's biscuit. We'll be able to see what the differences are like in how you make them and what they taste like. I wanted to take just a moment to talk about White Lily Flour. So recently we were contacted by the folks at White Lily Flour. They said they enjoyed what we were doing on the channel and they thought we might enjoy trying out some of their flour. Communicating with the folks at White Lily Flour has been wonderful. They sent us a batch to try out and we thought, let's put it to the test. All the biscuits that we're making in this episode were made with White Lily Flour, and we use a lot of flour on this channel, and this has been some of the best flour we've ever used. I encourage you to try this flour. For more information on White Lily Flour, visit whitelily.com.
This morning I got up to make some nice modern biscuits, and there are a couple of things that they really stress in modern recipes that you don't see in period cookbooks. One is that the butter stays cold. I put the butter in the freezer for about 30 minutes and then I grated that into the dry ingredients. The other is laminating the dough. You'll see that with other types of pastry in the 18th century, but you don't see that with biscuits. And so if you want these nice flaky layers, you want cold butter and you want to laminate the dough. So that's what I did for these modern ones. It's a little bit different than what we're going to do. In the 19th century recipe, you'll see baking powder, which is like modern biscuits, but you're not going to see the cold ingredients and you're not going to see the lamination of the dough.
So the real big difference is as we go back into the 18th century, we find a recipe by Margaretta Curley, and she writes to a newspaper in Great Britain, and she's telling them about the American potash cake. And it's such a great story. It's a giant long letter, and she's explaining when you would make these and why they do it, and then she gives us the recipe for it. Wonderful, wonderful recipe. What are the big differences here? Well, the leavening agent isn't baking powder, but it's actually it's potassium carbonate. Now that's a very different sort of thing than baking powder, which has the component of sodium bicarbonate. So sodium bicarbonate is a very active ingredient here. It gives a lot of lift. This one is a primitive version of that. It's just carbonate, not bicarbonate, so it kind of gives you a half lift, right? So it's and it's potassium, which can, if you use too much of it, give you a soapy flavor. So you don't want to overdo it trying to get it fluffier, and then you get soapy biscuits. But everything else is pretty similar. We're going to be using almost the same amount of flour. We're going to use a little bit of milk here, and this one has butter in it. I think his recipe, he's going to be working with just cream. So there's some fats here. This one also is meant to be a little bit more desserty, so it has some sugar in it, but not a great quantity. So let me read to you Margaretta Curley's recipe out of this big letter. She says, a good recipe for this cake is as follows. Take of a good wheaten flour 2 pounds, of butter 1/2 pound, of sugar 1/2 pound. Add to these a heaping teaspoonful of salt of tartar or any other form of potash or pearl ash that will hiss when vinegar is poured on it. We're not supposed to use vinegar in this recipe, but it's just how you identify it. The potash must be dissolved in a little water before it is added to the other materials, and the sugar is stirred in about a pint of milk, and being freed from lumps, the whole must be mixed and kneaded well together. This may be done in a few minutes, and the dough will instantly be fit for rolling out and baking.
So my recipe is from the Farm and Home Cookbook, and it's baking powder biscuits number 2. To 1 quart sifted flour, add 3 teaspoons baking powder, a little salt, 1 cup rich sweet cream, and milk enough to make a dough of the proper consistency. It's that simple. So in this time period, I've seen references to not using rolling pin, but just using your hands. And if you haven't made biscuits before, it's really easy. The key is to not overwork the dough. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to mix your dry ingredients in a bowl, give it a quick swirl so they're all incorporated together. You add your wet ingredients, mix those ingredients up into a dough, don't overwork it. Then you're going to turn it out onto a floured surface, press it out about 1 inch thick, and then cut them into circles, put them on a baking sheet, and in the oven they go.
It's time to try out our 3 different kinds of biscuits. We've got the 1799, we've got the late 19th century, let's call them 1900. And then we have the modern day biscuit. Which one are you gonna try first?
Let's go earlier to later.
Okay, earlier to later.
So let's see here. You want to break it?
Yeah, so here's our original Margaretta Curley potash cake. And obviously you can see by the size, they started out about the same thickness. These did not grow as much, that's for sure. But
they look like it worked.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
fluffy.
There's some leavening in there. They're not rock hard like a ship's biscuit. These have some sugar in them.
Just a little bit sweet, not too much. These are really good.
Now, this recipe did not have any salt in it. And you can definitely tell that it probably needed a little salt. She expected some of that. If you use sodium bicarbonate in here, you can get some of that sodium from it, and you get a little bit of, you know, salt flavor, even if you don't add salt in a soda biscuit. This one just has the potassium. It's even better with the butter.
What isn't?
Yeah, exactly. Really good, though. These baked the same amount of time. Both of the biscuits we were working with.
Yep.
You can tell, though, what's happening with this one. If you look real closely at some of these biscuits, you'll see that they're starting to crack open. So the leavening only starts to act when it's heated up. So if the biscuit starts to bake on the outside, it gets hard, and then it starts to expand, and you get cracking.
Right, whereas these, we could see them starting to rise even before we put them in the oven. You know,
Right.
and then they rise even more when they're in the oven.
Right, so baking powder is sort of double acting.
Yeah.
As soon as it gets wet, the acid starts to react with the baking soda that's built into that, and they start rising just as soon as they get wet, but they rise some more when they heat up.
They look a ton different on the
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah, so definitely fluffier.
Yeah,
The
right.
outside isn't so hard.
They're not getting those layers that we talked about with the modern biscuit. Kind of, maybe a little bit, but not so much. Tastes like a breakfast biscuit.
It does.
Yeah, this one, the one from the 18th century had that sweetness that felt like it could be a snack or a dessert or something like that. But this is, when you taste this immediately, I think you're like, "Where's the sausage gravy?" This is a breakfast biscuit.
Yeah. Very, very good. But you can see there's definitely a evolution as we're working here, lighter and fluffier. We got a little bit more salt, a little more savory flavor in it. The final biscuit to test this is the, well, where would you find this?
I mean, if you look up a biscuit recipe, if you just Google one, you'll find a biscuit exactly like this. This is what people want when they think biscuits in 2021. And already it doesn't just like break, you know, it kind of like bends and tears.
And we get these
tons of layers,
wonderful flaking layers and flakiness.
Right.
Much more delicate. We have more natural sort of a buttery saltiness in here. Does this have butter in it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Quite a bit, actually. Yeah, it's this is a lot like if you got a can of biscuits and you weren't going to make them homemade, and it's like a can of, you know, whatever brand biscuits, popped it open, baked them. You're going to get something like this. I feel like the 1900 one is more like maybe what my grandmother would have made. And it doesn't have those layers. It's a little bit more dense, but it still has the salt. But yeah, it's really good.
So the interesting take on all of these is that they're meant to be a fast bread-like item. You don't take hours and hours to make these. You just whip them right up. She even mentions that in the 1799 recipe. She says, oh, you have guests come over and you didn't expect them. You don't have time, 4 hours to bake a loaf of bread. You need bread right away. And that's why they invented these. They invented them to be a quick bread-like thing to give your guests.
Yeah, I wonder if that's why some of them you'll see more ingredients than others too. Like these 1901, it's just like cream, salt, flour. That's it. Yeah. Or a little bit baking powder, but yeah. Everything you'll probably have on hand because it's a pantry item.
And you can just make it right away.
Yeah.
Isn't it great to see this 200-year evolution of a simple proto-biscuit? Not quite what we would expect to be a biscuit at all, as it changes into the 19th century, and then we get to our wonderful, fluffy, modern biscuit. I love this whole tracing food back through time to see exactly where it came from and the amazing American roots of our modern biscuit. Ryan, thank you so much for coming in and doing all the prep work on this one. It was a blast doing all the research for it and connecting these up. So thank you for that. And if you want to see another episode where we, sort of test the waters on several different things that are very similar, check out this crumpet controversy episode. It's a good one.